This story came to me from a listener who simply signed his name as Paul. The story he shared wasn't just a tale of the past, but a chilling reminder of how some memories refuse to fade, how some experiences linger, haunting the edges of our lives. Paul wrote about his grandfather, a hard-working man who spent his youth in the rugged Appalachian highlands of North Carolina. A man who never sought attention, never needed the spotlight, but carried with him a story so vivid, so terrifying, that he passed it down as a warning. And now Paul shares it with us, not as fiction, but as a piece of his family's history. So, turn down the lights and listen carefully. Because this story, as Paul tells it, is not just about the shadows in the forest. It's about what happens when you're unlucky enough to meet what's hiding in them. Step into the abyss and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. Thanks for letting me share this story. It's one my grandpa told me over and over when I was growing up. Honestly, I'm not sure if he told it so many times because he wanted to scare me or because he just needed to get it off his chest. Either way, it stuck with me. He always swore it was true, and the way he told it, I believe him. Grandpa wasn't the kind of guy to make stuff up. He'd seen his fair share of hard times, so he wasn't easily rattled. But whenever he talked about this particular story, I could tell it shook him. Even decades later, you could see it in his eyes. So, here it is, his story, the way he told it to me. This all happened back in 1947. My grandpa, Henry, was in his early 20s and working as a logger in the Appalachian highlands of North Carolina. Back then, the timber industry wasn't what it used to be. After the 1920s, most of the big timber was gone, and there wasn't much left to cut. But people still had to make a living, and logging was all Grandpa knew. He worked with a small crew, moving from one remote spot to another, trying to squeeze what they could out of the forest. Their latest job had them up near a place called Black Hollow. Even the name sounded ominous, and according to Grandpa, the locals had plenty of stories about it. He said people whispered about strange disappearances and something unnatural that roamed the woods. But, as he always said, you didn't have the luxury of being scared when there were mouths to feed. At first, everything seemed normal. They set up camp on a ridge near Black Hollow, close to a creek they could use for water. The crew got to work cutting down what trees were left, hauling the timber to the creek and floating it downstream. It was hard, back-breaking work, but they were used to it. The first few nights, Grandpa said, were just like any other. The guys would sit around the fire, telling stories and drinking whatever moonshine they'd managed to smuggle in. But by the third night, things started to feel off. It was small stuff at first. Strange noises in the distance like howls, but deeper and more guttural than anything they'd heard before. The horses, which they used to haul supplies, started acting skittish. Grandpa said one of them even broke free from its tether and bolted into the woods. They joked about it being a bear or a mountain lion, but he could tell the men were uneasy. Then came the night they'd never forget. Grandpa said it was just past midnight, and most of the crew had turned in for the night. The fire was dying down, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet, he said. That's when they heard it, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What in God's name was that?" one of the men whispered, his voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, something massive crashed through the trees at the edge of camp. Grandpa said it was like a nightmare come to life. The creature was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with pale, leathery skin stretched tight over its frame. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was full of jagged, uneven teeth. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't belong in this world. The men froze, too terrified to move. Then the creature let out this horrible, ear-splitting roar. Grandpa said it was like nothing he'd ever heard, a mix of a scream and a growl that made his blood run cold. The sound seemed to press on your chest, making it hard to breathe. It circled the camp just outside the firelight, its massive silhouette flickering between the trees. Every so often, its glowing eyes would appear, watching them, taunting them. When it finally stepped into the light, it was worse than anything they'd imagined. Its body was gaunt and twisted, its limbs too long, its hands ending in claws that looked sharp enough to tear through bone. And that smell, a mix of wet earth and something rotting. Grandpa said it was like death itself had come for them. Panic set in. One of the guys, Sam, grabbed his rifle and fired a shot. The bullet hit the creature's shoulder, but instead of going down, it let out a deafening screech and lunged toward him. Sam barely had time to dive out of the way as the creature's claws slashed through the air, leaving deep gouges in the tree behind him. The camp erupted into chaos. Men were shouting, stumbling over each other as they tried to grab whatever they could to defend themselves. The creature moved through them like a storm, swiping at tents, overturning supply carts, and sending equipment flying. Grandpa said it picked up a log, a massive one they'd cut earlier that day, and hurled it across the clearing like it was a twig. It hit one of the carts with a sickening crash, shattering it to pieces. Grandpa dove behind a log, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He peeked out and saw the creature standing in the middle of the camp, its chest heaving, its glowing eyes scanning the men like it was deciding who to go after next. Then it let out another roar, this one so loud it felt like the ground shook. Grandpa said it wasn't just a sound, it was a warning, a challenge, and a promise, all rolled into one. At one point, it grabbed one of the supply crates and smashed it against a tree. The contents spilled out, scattering tools and food everywhere. The smell of spilled kerosene mixed with the stench of the creature, making the air almost unbearable to breathe. Grandpa said it was like being trapped in a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Realizing they couldn't fight it, Grandpa and a few others made a desperate run for the tree line. The creature's glowing eyes followed them, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate. But then it moved, faster than they thought possible, crashing through the underbrush like a freight train. Grandpa tripped over a root, falling hard and cutting his arm on a jagged rock. He scrambled to his feet, his blood slick on his hands, and looked back. The creature was right there, its claws raking the air just inches from his back. He could feel its hot breath on his neck, hear the low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. Then, out of nowhere, a train whistle blew in the distance. The sound echoed through the mountains, loud and piercing. The creature froze, its head snapping up like it was startled. It let out a guttural scream, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, Grandpa thought it might keep coming, but then it turned and disappeared into the shadows, its massive form melting into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Grandpa and the others didn't stop running until they were miles away. When they finally collapsed, gasping for breath, they realized how close they'd come to not making it out alive. Grandpa said he could still feel the creature's eyes on him, even long after it was gone. By morning, the camp was destroyed. Tents were shredded, supplies were scattered everywhere, and the horses were gone. The men packed up what little they could carry and left Black Hollow, swearing never to return. Grandpa said he heard stories over the years about other strange encounters in the area. Old miners and loggers talked about a guardian of the forest that didn't take kindly to intruders. Some claimed it was a spirit. Others thought it was a creature that had been there long before people ever came to the mountains. Grandpa never went back to Black Hollow, and he never forgot what happened there. He always said the forest was a place of respect, and if you didn't treat it right, it would remind you who was really in charge. And so, the Appalachian Highlands keep their secrets hidden among the towering oaks and the misty hills, a forest that guards its own, unwilling to be tamed, and a creature that reminds us we may not be the masters of every wild place. For Henry, it was a memory he carried with him, a warning etched into his mind and passed down through generations. Respect the forest, he would say. Know your place. Because sometimes the shadows are more than just shadows, and the sounds you hear at night aren't just the wind. The wilderness isn't just a backdrop for our adventures. It's alive, ancient, and maybe watching. Some places are best left undisturbed. It started as a hunting trip, a weekend in the woods, a chance to test a new rifle and maybe bag a few deer. But what happened next? Well, that's the kind of story that changes you. Black Creek is one of those places, a stretch of dense forest on the Ohio-West Virginia border, where the trees grow thick, the fog clings low, and the silence has a way of making your skin crawl. For generations, locals have whispered about the shadows that move between the trees, the strange howls that pierce the night, and the massive footprints found in the snow. Most call it folklore. Others swear it's real. What you're about to hear isn't just a campfire tale, it's a first-hand account, told by someone who lived through it. Someone who thought they were alone in those woods, until they realized they weren't. And once you hear what happened, you might think twice about venturing into Black Creek, because some places aren't just wild, they're watching. It started as a hunting trip, a weekend in the woods, a chance to test a new rifle and maybe bag a few deer. But what happened next? Well, that's the kind of story that changes you. Black Creek is one of those places, a stretch of dense forest on the Ohio-West Virginia border, where the trees grow thick, the fog clings low, and the silence has a way of making your skin crawl. For generations, locals have whispered about the shadows that move between the trees, the strange howls that pierce the night, and the massive footprints found in the snow. Most call it folklore. Others swear it's real. What you're about to hear isn't just a campfire tale. It's a first-hand account told by someone who lived through it. Someone who thought they were alone in those woods, until they realized they weren't. And once you hear what happened, you might think twice about venturing into Black Creek. Because some places aren't just wild, they're watching. You ever heard of Black Creek? It's one of those places on the Ohio-West Virginia border, tucked deep into the hills and so far out you'd swear it's the edge of the earth. It's prime hunting ground, especially in late fall. The trees are mostly bare by then, and the underbrush is thin enough to actually see what you're tracking. But I'm telling you right now, after what happened to me last year, you couldn't pay me to step foot in those woods again. It was late November, right in the heart of hunting season. I'd just gotten a new rifle and wanted to try it out, so I decided to spend a weekend at my buddy's cabin near Black Creek. His name's Doug, a big burly guy who's been hunting since he could walk. He knows those woods better than anyone. Doug couldn't make it out that weekend, so it was just me and his brother Tim. Tim's a bit younger than us and not as experienced, but he's a good shot and always up for an adventure. We got to the cabin Friday night, just as the sun was setting. The place was about as remote as you could get. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just a little wooden shack surrounded by towering oaks and pines. It's the kind of quiet that's almost too quiet, if you know what I mean. We unpacked, had a couple beers, and made a plan for the morning. We were up before dawn. The air was cold, sharp enough to make your lungs ache, and a thick fog clung to the ground. Tim and I split up, each heading to our own stand about half a mile apart. My spot was near a dried-up creek bed, a place Doug swore by. He said the deer loved to pass through there early in the morning. As the sun started to rise, the woods came alive. I could hear the usual sounds, squirrels rustling in the leaves, the occasional crow calling out. But then, about an hour in, everything went still. And, I mean dead still. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just this heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I figured maybe there was a coyote nearby. Or a bear, though Doug had said they're pretty rare around there. Still, I kept my rifle close and stayed alert. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural grunt. Not like a bear, though. This was deeper, almost like a growl, but it had this weird, human quality to it. It came from somewhere off to my left, deep in the trees. I sat there, frozen, scanning the woods. The fog made it hard to see more than 50 feet, but I caught movement. Something big. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then it stepped into a patch of sunlight, and my stomach dropped. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with broad shoulders and a barrel chest. Its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, but the face was almost human. It had these deep-set eyes that locked onto me like it was sizing me up. Its nose was flat, its jaw heavy, and its mouth, I swear it almost looked like it was sneering. Then it let out a sound that I'll never forget. A low, rumbling growl that turned into a high-pitched screech, almost like a scream. It was so loud it felt like it rattled my chest. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at this thing as it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. That's when I noticed its hands. They weren't paws or claws like you'd expect on an animal. They were hands, huge, with long fingers and thick black nails that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep it steady. The creature stopped, tilting its head like it was curious, and then it smiled. I'm not kidding. It actually smiled. Not a friendly smile, but this twisted, menacing grin that sent a chill down my spine. I knew I couldn't stay there. Slowly, I started backing away, keeping my rifle trained on it. But as soon as I took my first step, the creature let out another scream and started moving toward me. Its movements were fast and jerky, almost unnatural. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush and not caring about the noise I was making. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground, branches snapping like twigs as it tore through the trees. It was gaining on me, and I knew I couldn't outrun it. I tripped over a root and went sprawling, my rifle flying out of my hands. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it wildly as the creature closed in. Just as it was about to reach me, a loud gunshot echoed through the woods. The creature stopped abruptly, its head snapping toward the sound. Tim had heard the commotion and fired a warning shot from his stand. The creature let out one last roar before turning and disappearing into the fog. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Tim and I ran all the way back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us and locking it. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, listening to the silence outside, waiting to hear if it was still out there. The next day, we packed up and left. On the way back, we stopped at a little diner in town. The waitress, an older lady named Ruth, noticed we looked spooked and asked what happened. When we told her, her face went serious. "You saw him," she said quietly. "We call him Red. He's been around these parts for as long as anyone can remember." She told us about other hunters and fishermen who'd had similar encounters. One guy said he was out night fishing on the creek when he saw Red standing on the opposite bank, just watching him. Another claimed he'd found massive footprints in the snow, each one nearly 2 feet long with visible toe impressions. Doug's neighbor, an old-timer named Hank, once told me about hearing strange howls when he was camping near Black Creek as a teenager. He said they didn't sound like anything he'd heard before, and they seemed to follow him wherever he went. He never saw what made them, but he'd always pack up and leave as soon as he heard them. I haven't been back to Black Creek since, and I don't plan to. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It was smart. It was watching us. And I'll tell you this, there are some places where humans just don't belong. So, if you're ever out that way during hunting season, keep your eyes open, and if the woods go quiet, run. And so, what began as a simple hunting trip turned into a brush with the unknown, a glimpse into something that defies explanation. Black Creek remains as it always has been, silent, foreboding, and full of secrets. For our hunter, it was a lesson learned the hard way. Sometimes, the biggest predator in the forest isn't the one you're hunting. It's the one you never knew was hunting you. Nature has its own rules, and in its wildest corners, we are not the apex. Sometimes, survival is about knowing when to leave and when to never go back. My dear watchers, your presence is a gift. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, your courage. But remember, there are others who wander, unaware of the dangers that await. By liking this video and subscribing, you offer them a light in the darkness. Support our channel and keep the stories coming, simply by giving a thumbs up and subscribing and sharing.